I spent about 8.5 years there for BMW, mostly in roles around regulatory compliance. My last role at BMW actually was launching their performance and motorsport parts brand in the United States, which sounds like a really fun job, and it was a really fun job. I spent a lot of time at racetracks, and at the end of the day, I came in late 2008, I came to start thinking more about what I was really doing with my career. And a couple of things really jumped out at me. The first was that I was living in New York at the time and found that the transportation system was really difficult to use, even when I had a free car from BMW. I found myself kind of thinking that was a very odd position to be in. And the other thing that I saw was that BMW sold, in Europe, sold about 8 different engines in the 3 Series, and only in the United States, the 2 highest output and highest fuel consumption engines came to this market. And to me, that really jumped out as being potentially an indicator that there was a regulatory issue at hand, not necessarily so much of an engineering issue. So these 2 things really actually drove me to apply to grad school. Went back to grad school at MIT, studied the integration of electrification and shared mobility, and I wanted to really implement what I was doing in the real world as well. And so I decided to apply for a role at the U.S. Department of Transportation on the fuel economy team. So many of you are probably aware there's a regulation called CAFE. It stands for Corporate Average Fuel Economy. And so I did a lot of modeling work behind the Obama-era CAFE regulations. We can talk about that all day if we want to. So finished up that work and became aware of this position at Stanford. I came out here about 3.5 years ago. My role, broadly speaking, is to supervise a portfolio of research around the future of mobility. Our work is supported by about 40 different companies in the mobility space, and I see some friendly faces in the room that support our work. And that's where I am today.
So in my case, actually, I was saying, I have my story in Silicon Valley actually connects me with the predecessor to TIBCO, Technicron. So I did my first startup in 1990, 91. And at that time, it was Technicron Information Systems. And we had a startup that was sort of competing and sort of collaborating with that. But spent the 90s between 2 startups, and in between the startups, after selling the first and before starting the second, I was general manager at IBM, running their BI and analytics and data warehousing division. I should say that I've been in data and AI since '82, which is hard to believe. When I say to some people that I've been through the previous AI spring, and which ended in '91. Anyway, after selling my second company, I came to the venture side first as a general partner at Apex Partners, and later on at Trident Capital. And about 3.5 years ago, with one of my colleagues from Trident, we started Synapse. And I came to the automotive and transportation side, frankly, on the big data route, because I kept hearing about what autonomous vehicles will produce and how cities will be instrumented, and I was not hearing enough about what will be done with all of this data, how it will be collected, how it will be managed, how it will be analyzed. So always being taught that the best way to learn something is to either teach it or write about it. I started writing a series of blogs, which later became a book. The more I was writing and the more I was spending time with the industry, the more excited I was becoming about even the investment prospects. So today, about half of our portfolio at Synapse is mobility related. And we work with some very large corporations, collaborating with them, helping them understand how startups can help them. But we also do some original work in that space. And so when Ravi approached me about talking about the work, I said, Stephen and I have been talking about some of these topics for about a year now. And so I said, would you mind if we have a conversation and about the topic? And I would be gracious as he is. He said, that's a good idea, so that's what brings us to today. The one thing I will say so let us go for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions, see what you think and what your questions may be, and then if you don't have any questions, as Stephen said, we can continue talking till we're blue in the face. Again, thank you very much for coming here on a Monday night on the 29th of July. So Stephen, we started talking about having these corporations being at a crossroads, but there are some mega trends there that's bringing them to that position. So just to get us going, why don't we talk a little bit about it?
Sure, I think that's a great place to start. Just out of show of hands, how many of you have read the blog? All right, excellent. Well, that's a typical Medium post. A friend of mine, by the way, I said that we would publish this on Medium, and I forwarded him the link, and he said, you know what they say about Medium, right? It's neither rare nor well done. So I think the megatrends is actually a great place to start, because that's the thing that people tend to talk about quite a bit in this space. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the CASE or ACES acronym, your preferred order of those 4 letters, connectivity, automation, electrification, and sharing. And I think that's really only part of the story. I think that, yes, we've seen a lot of development in that space, but I think it's also happening against a backdrop of broader questions. And really those are, I think, an increasing recognition that we've got some pretty serious social problems that are not being addressed or to which transportation is kind of a contributing factor. So just to get through a couple of those, I think the first would be climate, CO2. I think there's increasing recognition, at least in most major countries, that CO2 is a real problem, and yes, we're the cause of it. And by the way, transportation in most developed countries is either the top or one of the top contributors to CO2 emissions. So if you're going to look for a place to try to fix the climate problem, transportation is a really good place to start, right? So that's the first thing that I would say. Second thing that I would say has to do with safety. If you talk to officials in the Department of Transportation in the US or in other countries, people talk about it as an epidemic, a safety epidemic. And the numbers are pretty staggering. 40,000 people every year die in traffic accidents in the US. If you broaden that to worldwide, it's closer to 1 million. And we hit the uncomfortable statistic just a couple of years ago that the number of people that have died in traffic fatalities since 2000 is about the same as the number of soldiers that died in the 2 world wars combined, right? So people just trying to find the language to put around the staggering numbers that we're seeing, right? So that's the second one I would say is safety. So CO2 safety. Another one that I would say is up there is congestion. And the reason I mention congestion is because that's the one that's very visible to us, right? We see it here in Silicon Valley in terms of the distances and times that people are willing to commute to get to a job. And you see a lot of people, you meet a lot of people that are commuting an hour and a half, maybe even more each way. And in major cities around the world, you're seeing traffic speeds that are really down to walking pace. I think New York City during rush hour is about 4 miles an hour average travel speeds in Manhattan, right? You might as well walk at that point.
Actually, I'll tell you, so on Thursday I was in New York, and I was taking a car going to Midtown, and it was about 4 o'clock. We're on 3rd Avenue and I think 30th. And we were going to 50th Street, and at one point the guy turns back to me and said, you know what, I think you're going to get there faster walking. And I said, okay.
Not wrong.
And we ended up, we discussed a little bit. It was kind of warm, and I had a meeting, and I did not want to be drenched by the time I got there. But it is true, it ended up taking, 15 blocks that we had to do to get
Yeah.
So, and it's the summer, by the way. A lot of New York is on vacation right now. So, anyway.
Well, I mean, that's another whole angle we can get into, you know, when and where things, new mobility solutions are suitable. I think that's an interesting topic in and of itself. But just to wrap up this thought, so megatrends, I think I view this as a push and a pull. So you've got the push of these increasingly urgent social problems, and I would view the ACEs as the pull, as the technology that could potentially enable you to address some of these problems. And maybe the last piece that I would bring up before we move on is really the fact that some of the things that customers really desire, which is making more productive use of the time in the car, potentially having a better predictor of when they're going to arrive. The solutions to these types of questions, the things that customers are interested in, solving, let's say, the parking problem. These are problems that can't really be solved by an OEM, at least not in isolation. And so I think what we're seeing is new entry into this space to try to provide solutions to these types of problems that maybe the car manufacturers can't tackle alone. And I think that's really kind of what you and I viewed as maybe one of the kind of the opening avenues into this space. And we've seen quite a few current events that give us some pause about what's happening in the industry. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the current events that we're seeing.
So if you think about it, so the last couple of weeks have been extremely interesting in the industry. If you want to think about the kind of like the incumbent industry. So I was keeping track of. There are a number of OEMs that either pre-announced bad results or they announced that they're going to miss in some way. So Nissan, top of the list, they will end up letting go about 10,000, more than 10,000 employees. Ford pre-announced. Tesla had pretty bad results on the profitability side, even though they got to the volumes that they wanted. Daimler now is work in progress. BMW, Aston Martin missed by a lot. Renault, JLR. PSA and Volkswagen, the only ones so far. So we're waiting to see what GM is going to say, even though they gave us already a surprise with what they're going to do with their autonomous vehicles. They're going to delay the introduction of Cruise. And then same story, maybe in some instances even worse, on the tier 1 suppliers. I mean, these are huge corporations. Like, so you talk about companies like Lear, Continental, Valeo, Aptiv, Bosch, Delphi, Visteon. So these are huge companies that are starting to have not so miss their targets, their quarterly targets, and some of it because of these mega trends, some of it because of what's happening in China. And as this is happening now, they'll have to start thinking about what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with the investments in these new technologies to address these mega trends that Stephen talked about, and how am I going to deal with investments in my traditional, my existing business models, my existing lines. So again, to just give you an idea, Volkswagen said that over the next 5 years, they will need to spend $30 billion, euro, sorry, it's coming from his way, it's going to come about soon. So 30 billion euro on electrification alone. Okay. So these are huge numbers that they have to deal with. So again, just to tell you how everything is starting to impact these companies, is that in the last few months, we had a number of CEO changes. So, and based on these changes, you can see the dilemma that these companies are starting to face. So BMW had a CEO change most recently. They brought somebody from production. So obviously they're thinking much more about existing business models as opposed to future technologies and future business models. Daimler did the exact opposite. Daimler brought a technologist to be their new CEO. Before that, so over a year old now, is the change that Ford made. Ford let go of a 25-year veteran who was their CEO and replaced him with somebody with no automotive experience, with a heavy new mobility thinking. I'm forgetting, Nissan, right? Nissan went with a old style again. So you could see that they're feeling this dilemma in terms of what's happening. And by the way, I should also say that cities are also starting to feel that kind of pressure. I was reading over the weekend, Boston now is going to approve a $15 billion bond in order to start fixing their public transportation system because of what they see with regards to congestion and what they see with regards to their existing infrastructure to be able to take care of things.
I think that's actually a really good point. So maybe I would bin that as another aspect of this megatrends conversation, which is that the U.S. has dramatically underinvested in infrastructure for decades, right? That's probably no secret to anybody in this room. And I think some of the chickens are coming home to roost there in terms of the impact that you're starting to see. You're seeing bridge decay, you're seeing delays in the public transit system. I had a friend that actually wanted to come down from the city to this event on Caltrain, and he realized he actually wasn't going to make it in time because the Caltrain service is interrupted, right? So I think in some ways, cities actually view this as maybe something that might save them, right? So from having to pay the debt on this underinvestment for decades, maybe somehow if we can dramatically transform the efficiency of our transportation systems, then that'll save us from this, many billions of dollars investment.
Yeah, and I think that when we were starting on this new mobility idea, so again, when I started writing about it a few years ago, I would interview corporate executives, and there was this competitive spirit that we will do everything ourselves, right? We will, GM will do one thing, Ford will do another thing, Daimler will do another thing. And I think between everything that you described and what is happening and how it is affecting the industry, we're starting to see now a change in posture, right? So GM taking money from Honda, Ford partnering with Volkswagen. I think we will see more of that, and some of it will be reflected actually in how they partner with startups and private companies, and we'll talk about that down the line, I guess. But I think what is happening between the large corporations, to me, is very interesting, because again, it brings to focus this crossroads that they feel they are. Like, how do we, can I afford not to pay attention to new mobility? And if I have to go down the new mobility path, can I afford to do it all on my own?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to describe it. We've called this talks the industry at a crossroads, right? And that's not an accident. I think that to a certain extent, this is just an expression of the innovator's dilemma. For those of you probably are familiar with that term, the idea that you have a choice to make, right? That if you have a conventional, successful business that's potentially being disrupted by a promising new business, how do you deal with it? Because all logic says that you should continue investing in this profitable existing business and continue to reap the rewards from doing that. Yet, there's this kind of instinct that you might need to be investing in this new business because potentially things will change down the road. And Evangelos and I were talking. We found a couple of things that we think that kind of exacerbate this problem in the automotive space. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Right. So the we've been thinking about what is going, how the incumbent automotive industry and the new mobility are starting to, how they're different, how they're very similar in certain ways, which again exacerbates this dilemma. So if you think about the automotive industry, It's kind of like a low margin, high capital, very, very capital intensive, very labor intensive industry. And what is saving it is the fact that this $1 trillion plus a year, and what most OEMs are trying to do is they're trying to make up the low margin with the volume, right? That's why, in fact, what is happening with Tesla these days is problematic, right? Because Tesla was being touted as being this high margin business, and now they're starting to realize that they're starting to look very much like the typical incumbent. So in other words, in order to meet their volume, the volume expectation that they set for Wall Street, they have to discount and they have to take a hit on their margins. And we'll see how they recoup. I mean, you have some OEMs that are realizing that this cannot continue, so they're starting to put profitability ahead of volume. I think what we saw with GM and Ford here in the US is very telling of that. I mean, this company said that we're not going to continue making sedans. We're going to focus just on segments and models that are more profitable for us. Even if that means we'll close some factories or we'll repurpose some factories. So that's the OEM. But then if you look at mobility services, I mean, look, to date, and in fact, I'm trying to analyze this now for my new book. So far, mobility services, as it is prototyped by ride-hailing, it's a low-margin business, okay? And if you think about the first iteration of TNCs, it's a labor-intensive business. I mean, you need to have a lot of drivers to be able to support the demand, and of course, because you do not know what the demand is going to be, you have to overcompensate, because what we've shown over and over is that consumers don't want to wait. So when they open that application, if they see, okay, it's going to take 8 minutes for your car to arrive, they'll switch and go to the competitor, right? So in order to deal with low ETA, you have to over-recruit drivers and maintain them and all of that. So, and this is a very capital-intensive business, right? I mean, think of how much money. I mean, now it's very easy to track Uber and Lyft. They're public companies. They cannot hide anymore. I mean, today, Uber laid off 400 people in their marketing organization because now they're feeling the pressure from the street, right? You cannot just be unprofitable forever, right?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, they're both extremely capital-intensive businesses. They're capital-intensive for entirely different reasons, right? I think that the mobility space is really pressured by at least two key facts that come to mind for me. The first is that ownership of cars, at least in the United States, is heavily biased towards the fixed costs and only slightly biased towards the marginal costs. Obviously, that depends on where you live. In other countries, the story is a little different. But by and large, if you own a car, the most sensible choice to make when you take a trip is take that car, right? And so to a certain extent, what the ride-hailing companies are really trying to do is they're trying to sell their product below cost to the point where even if you own a car, you say, maybe I don't want to sit in the front seat. Maybe I'll sit in the back seat and do a few emails or catch up on Netflix, while somebody else drives me. So I think that's one thing that really pressures the price down in the ride-hailing space. One of the other things that pressures the price down is that one of its competitors is public transit, right? Many of you probably know that public transit doesn't make money. Everybody know that?
Yeah.
Okay, so public transit, in fact, there's a term from public transit called the fare box recovery ratio. And what that means is for every dollar that you spend to provide service, how many pennies of that dollar do you actually recover in the form of the fares that the passengers pay you, right? It's pretty rare that that number is more than 50, right? So most of the time, the fares only cover about half that cost. In some cities, it's actually worse. So again, you have a service that's operated below cost that's competing against the mobility as a service space, right? So again, exactly as you're describing, you have a capital-intensive business. Again, capital-intensive because you're trying to subsidize those drivers. It's low margin, again, I think because of the competition in the form of privately owned vehicles. It's labor-intensive, like you said, it's a one-to-one, basically driver-to-passenger ratio, at least in most places today. And I think that maybe the point that you and I thought was most interesting here is it's unclear when that's actually going to turn the corner.
And what barriers to entry, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Think of what's happening in micromobility. Think of what, how many companies or even with ride-hailing, you have a number of companies, like some of them are starting to die out, but it's still the barriers to entry are relatively low.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that one of the things that you see, Evangelos was mentioning the idea of recruiting drivers, and we talked about that as a form of expense. And I think you actually see that manifest itself in some of the incentive structures that you see in this space. I see it particularly around the driver incentive structures. I signed up as a driver, in fact, as part of a research project a couple of years ago. And one of the things that you see is the drivers are pressured relentlessly to basically stay on platform as long as possible. And a lot of the incentive structures really are promoting numbers of trips or time on platform or other kinds of metrics like that that are almost out of reach. Well, why do you think that they do that? I mean, I think one reason is because you're trying to align demand, supply as closely as possible to demand. But one of the other things that achieves is that every passenger that a driver serves for one company is a passenger that can't be served for the other company. So it creates a form of lock-in and kind of tries to whack your competition while providing additional customer satisfaction on your side. So you see it's a very, very competitive space on the incentive side.
And I will also say, again, we've been doing some research on ride-hailing in particular. The early results that we're seeing is that a lot of them really do not understand their economics. And in fact, when they finally understand the economics, that becomes an extra aha moment to say, okay, well, what are we doing here, right? So there is this pressure which is increasing, by the way, because again, due to the profitability that these companies need to achieve, there's pressure to take money out of the fare and so give less to the driver, right? So we've talked to many drivers who say, I was making a lot more money, a year and a half, 2 years ago than I'm making now. We met drivers who say, I am, I've leased a vehicle, I cannot I cannot make up payments and all that. So as the OEMs are starting to consider, do I want to be in mobility services, and what mobility services do I want to support? These issues figure very prominently. Again, BMW went to Daimler and said, let's merge our mobility services organizations. Again, one of those very similar to what GM did by taking investment from Honda, or the partnership that Ford and Volkswagen did. Again, this is a different kind of partnership here between Daimler and BMW on the mobility services.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. Part of what you and I had talked about in our meetings was, well, why do you even want to do this in the first place, right? Why does a business that has lost $14 billion in capital sound appealing to you, right? If you're an automotive OEM, that seems like a rather strange place to want to migrate. So I think that the implicit assumption here is that this business will eventually become profitable. It's not clear that it'll become profitable in its current kind of manifestation. It's not clear that it'll become profitable soon. It's not clear how we'll get there. And so I think that just one of the premises that you just have to accept is, well, eventually it'll become at least marginally profitable.
It's not clear that it will become profitable across all geographies.
Right.
North America versus Asia.
Yeah, almost certainly there's going to be some form of cross-subsidization, and that's definitely happening now. There's a document that was leaked from one of the ride-hailing companies a couple of years ago that seemed to indicate that some markets were already profitable. So if you were to cut out the subsidization of the food delivery and of the automated vehicles and a few other things, some of those markets were probably profitable, where you have dense travel demand, not just dense population, but density of travel demand as well. So if worse comes to worse, I think that still could be at least marginally profitable business, barring some of the continued investments. And so I think the question really is that you and I ended up with is, okay, let's presume that this is going to be a profitable business in net, right? And at least marginally so. And why does this look attractive to a company? And what is the kind of the decision, this crossroads that you and I talked about? What does that actually mean?
Well, before we go into that, any questions that we need to take based on what we covered up to now?
Maybe something that's been missing is high-speed rail, hyperloop, and flying taxis.
1 second here, we got a microphone.
I guess I didn't understand the question.
High-speed rail, hyperloop, and flying taxis.
Oh, okay, but what is the question?
Just what are your views on how soon and how this will disrupt the industry?
Why don't we table that for the end? I'm not sure exactly how I want to answer that. Let's come back to that one.
You did briefly mention micromobility, and I'd like to hear your perspective on where it fits when you talk about ACES.
Well, so a few things. I mean, everybody's probably tried a scooter at least once or twice in this room. I view it as just more of the experimentation that's happening in urban mobility. I think there's a lot of inherent appeal to micromobility, right? It's kind of a right sizing. From my perspective, if you want to solve some of these problems, the CO2 problem, the congestion problem, and you want to deliver some customer satisfaction, then you've got two options basically. You've either got to put more people in the vehicles, or you've got to make the vehicles smaller. And so, well, we're already trying to put more people in the vehicles, and this was an experiment to try to make those vehicles smaller. I think that there's some bigger concerns there. You've seen questions about safety, helmet usage, training, that kind of thing. One of the things you discover is safety for bicycling and helmet usage actually don't correlate all that well, which is kind of an interesting topic. What tends to correlate well with safety numbers for bicycling at least is planned infrastructure and dedicated lane space and that sort of thing. There are questions about the reliability of the vehicles themselves. So there was an analysis done in Louisville that seemed to indicate that vehicles were failing after just a month or two on the road. So I think the first instantiation of the micromobility business was basically just grab an off-the-shelf rechargeable scooter and then give it to the general public and see what happens. Well, people drive it like they stole it, right, is basically what happens. And they ride them over curbs, and they toss them into the bay, and they bash them against walls, and they pee on them, and all kinds of things that you see that just sort of mistreating the product. So, well, okay, we've got some user education to do, and we've got some iteration on the vehicles that are in use. But I basically view this as just, it's something, as we see the mobility as a service, the ride-hailing business model kind of mature and evolve, I think you see the micromobility business kind of coming and eating that from underneath. And so I think it's no accident that the micromobility providers have in some cases been acquired by the ride-hailing providers.
So I think, and again, this sets up nicely to what we're going to talk next, is that there is no question that a single transportation modality will not become the panacea in all the problems that we've been talking about. So, so we need to start thinking both in terms of multiple modalities being used in some collaborative fashion, as well as a lot more sharing. there is no way we will solve the problems that we talked about, whether it is with autonomous vehicles, with electric vehicles, or whatever, if we're only thinking single passenger modality. Okay, so we really need to start thinking about how we're going to take these different options that are coming up to, that are presented to us, and start weaving them, right, in order to address the transportation needs of particularly urban populations. So there will definitely be a need for last mile, so like 1 to 1.5 mile type of transportation, which may not be, ride-hailing may not be the right way to go. I think, as Stephen said, the big question is going to be whether the form factor that we now call micromobility is, whether it is e-scooters, e-bikes, bikes and e-bikes, is going to be the best form factor for those kind of distances. We may go to more pod-like structures. I mean, I'll tell you, Singapore is thinking a lot more about, 2-passenger pods for that first mile, last mile, 4-wheel, electric, all of that, right? So there was a question somewhere there, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Sanjay. Just a quick question. Recession tends to change the behavior of a lot of people and cause shifts in the way things are consumed, either on the customer side or the OEM side. Can you talk about what you may forecast should a recession set in the next couple of years?
Well, I think it could exacerbate some of the problems. That's kind of my gut reaction. Part of the problem that Evangelos and I are trying to articulate here is that you have to get away from the volume-based mentality and more towards the profit-based mentality. Some of the conversations that Evangelos and I have had over the past month or two have been around really the fact that you might be selling just as many cars as you were before, but you might be selling different cars to different customers, and that might actually shrink your profit margin, right? So, for example, somebody who's driving for Uber, for Lyft is probably more laser focused on getting the cheapest car to operate that they possibly can than somebody who's buying a car for private usage. And I think that that tends to erode the profit margins. Similarly, people still need a transportation device or a transportation service in the case of a recession, but it'll push them to cut corners, right? So things like taking Uber X instead of Uber Black, right? Or Uber Pool instead of Uber X, right? Or if they're buying a car, they might be buying the basic trim version instead of the regular trim version, moving down market. All of these problems exacerbate the bottom line if you're an OEM.
So there are, I would say, talk a little bit as an investor. So I think that this free flow of capital that we've seen over the past 5, 6, 7 years, particularly going to mobility companies, mobility startups, as called, is definitely going to be curtailed. We've seen this movie before in different sectors. I don't think there is particular insight on that. I will tell you that the database that we maintain at Synapse, just on software auto tech, we track about 1,300 startups. And this is North America, Europe, and Israel. We don't do anything in China or India and those areas. So we will see once recession starts, once we start seeing the signs of a recession, we'll see massive consolidation. A lot of startups will go out of business because you do not need X number of startups in autonomous vehicle stacks, and you probably need 2. You don't need Y number of startups in HD mapping. You maybe need 3. So you'll have a significant consolidation going on, and we are already starting to see, by the way, on the venture side, a rethinking of by investors, even though we're not in a recessionary period right now, we're rethinking of how much money should go into each of these subsectors. We're seeing broken rounds, We're seeing companies unable to attract any investor interest, and that, to us, that's kind of inevitable given the amount of, the number of companies that were funded. I also think, again, going back to the theme that we covered up to now, is that as the profits of the OEMs and tier ones start to shrink because of the recession and sometimes completely eliminated, now the amount of money that will be going towards these new technologies, whether it is because of the investments in startups, whether it is investments in their own internal initiatives, those will be really thought.
I think the bottom line is anytime there's a recession, everybody has to tighten their belt, right? And I think you see that affect decisions across the board. You see it in decisions around hiring. I spent a fair amount of time in the recruiting space, both as a recruiter for automotive companies and now as a mentor to students who are looking for jobs. And I think that you do see companies tighten their belts across the board. One of the things that kind of brings to the forefront is a question: how long will it actually take to accomplish some of these transitions that we think that the industry has ambitions to accomplish? And that's a really hard thing to think about because we've seen investments of, I think the last hard number that I saw was $80 billion invested in automation. Uber alone is now at $14 billion of capital earned. You even found that number $300 billion to accomplish a full industry-wide transition to electrification. Nobody really knows what the final number would be. And so if you have a hole that you're pouring money into to try to fill it, you kind of want to know how deep is that hole that I'm trying to fill. And that's a really tough question to answer. You've got some businesses, tech companies that are spitting off lots of free cash. And you've got automotive businesses that don't necessarily spin off all that much free cash. So I think the questions become a lot harder in terms of pursuing those investments.
So to follow up with that then, there's a ton of money being put into autonomy, and the goalpost seems to be stretching farther out. So is there, are we going to make it there? Are people going to run out of patience in funding these things? You mentioned there's going to be consolidation. I guess I'm just curious what your thought is on funding these. The simulation and other things, for example, there's a long ways to go. So
there's no question in my mind that we're going to get there. I think that what we need to rethink is what we mean by there, okay? And there are already very meaningful successes of autonomous vehicles in well-circumscribed environments. Agriculture, ports, mines, mining, yeah. Right? Aviation, right? Not VTOLs, but I've said before, if we, low-speed autonomy, I think holds a lot of promise, right, in dealing with downtown areas, for example, right, or college campuses or corporate campuses. I think where we have been led astray, if you will, and I don't want to appear like a victim here, but I think where we have gotten ahead of our skis is the general case of autonomy, right? So being able to say, either I'm going to go to my car dealer and pick up a level 4 car, and I will be commuting to work, and I will be doing my email and whatever. I will never have to think about the road. Or I will have a robo-taxi in an arbitrary city that will be able to navigate that city regardless of weather conditions, traffic conditions, whatever. I think that is going to be stretched out because people are finally realizing that this is not an exercise left for the reader, but it's a hard problem. And I think at the end of the day, again, Stephen said there are about 80 billion, give or take, that has been invested in autonomy between startups and internal efforts from large corporations. The thinking is that we may need about 100 billion more. So the question then is, who can stomach that? We'll that's where we'll start separating and determining how fast things will move. But I will also say something that I said to some of our corporate partners is that 9 women cannot give birth in 1 month. You still need 9 months, and sometimes less, but anyway. There's not much about this. Okay.
I had a quick question, just actually on that, about kind of solving that problem. I wanted you guys just to comment a little bit on how you see the kind of new economics of data driving kind of this industry. And is it creating kind of competitive forces that we haven't seen before, or is it going to tend towards kind of, you know, an industry landscape like, very similar to what we've seen in the past with the automotive industry? Or is it going to be kind of a, tend towards a duopolistic thing? It's going to look a lot more like the PEC industry or the cloud industry. There's going to be 2 big players because, they've amassed the majority of the data and therefore have the best algorithms and therefore have the best technology. Or do you think it's going to be more distributed and more disruptive?
Sure. I would say that if you look at the incumbent industry, the majority, if not all of them, really do not understand data, even if they say that we use data, we capture data, whatever. But the bottom line is they do not even know what is entailed about managing truly big data.
Mm-hmm.
There is definite maturity in that area. So between the time that I was doing the research for my first book and even today, you're seeing more companies partnering with the likes of Microsoft and Amazon to deal with large-scale data management, cloud-based data management. And I consider that a step in the right direction. Because what I was hearing 2 years ago is that we will build our own data centers. And I would sit down with CEOs and I'd say, do you know what kind of investment is necessary for you to build one data center, let alone, maybe one in each geography that you're serving, okay? So that's as I said, a step in the right direction. Now, the second part of your question, though, and I don't know what Stephen thinks about it, but I do not believe that at least the incumbent industry knows what it means to monetize data, in the way that we have seen the likes of Google and Facebook monetize in the through online advertising, right, on the internet sector. I don't think there is that type of understanding. So what I'm spending a lot of my time these days is trying to both both educate, rather, the type of business models that can emerge from the exploitation of data and the type of services that it will be possible for these companies, whether it is from the incumbent industry or even the more nascent mobility services industry to capitalize.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we had said in the piece was the traditional automotive industry, the manufacturers, don't actually know all that much about the customers themselves because they've got the dealer in the middle, right? So the dealer, in some cases, there are large dealer groups that are really competing with the manufacturers to try to own that customer, for lack of a better word. And you might have a dealer group that services 5 different OEMs. And so they'd rather have the knowledge about that customer and potentially shift that customer over to another OEM that they also happen to sell. And I think that obviously you see a very different direction in the mobility space. Mobility companies, and I think there's an article in the New York Times a couple of months ago that was talking about the sheer number of companies that know where you are and probably know something about what you're doing, right? It's a pretty big number, right? I think one of the things that we're starting to see in the transportation space is, okay, who actually has access to the data and then knows what to do with the data? And has the culture too. We can come back to that point too. That there are a lot of companies that just they gather data and they think, okay, someday this is going to be useful, some data is going to be useful. But then they're very unwilling to potentially collaborate with partners who might be actually be able to help them do something with that data. And I think, so number one is, yeah, I think there's increasingly broad recognition that the data is valuable, but you need the expertise to be able to do something with it. And two is you actually need, as Evangelos was saying, to build the infrastructure to deal with it. In the case of sort of the pipeline coming from fully automated vehicles, obviously that's a pretty big pipe indeed. I think the number that I had heard off the top of my head was something like 10, certainly less than 100 automated, fewer than 100 vehicles are generating data at the same rate as Facebook, right? So, just sort of to provide some context for the volume of data that you're talking about.
Yeah, the statistic I had on this was the vehicles that Waymo has ordered, about 80,000, if they were put on the road, they're going to be generating about 8 Facebooks per day. Just to put it into perspective. Again, you talk about 100,000 or 80,000 vehicles, which means serving a number of cities. This is not much, but still, I mean, you require, you need to process a lot of data. Even if you don't move everything to the cloud, you still need to process a lot of data in the vehicle, at the edge, and then ultimately in the cloud.
Yeah, so you have to recognize it's valuable. I think that's kind of, price of entry, right? You have to be able to have the infrastructure to support it. You have to know what you want to do with it, and then you have to have the expertise to turn that corner.
Do you see companies like, let's say, like a Google or a Tesla specifically, licensing their technology to the other manufacturers, or do you see them kind of doing the Apple playbook and trying to kind of keep it all siloed within their own industry, their own
Technology or
vertical?
data? Technology or data?
Yeah. Well, both, I guess, right?
I think you really kind of have to get specific about what you're talking about. I think Tesla has shown broad inclination to be willing to share certain technology and certain data. I think ride-hailing companies have shown broad inclination to share very limited sets of data. I think Google, didn't they just announce the public release of a data set a couple of days ago?
Well, Waymo did, yeah, and so did Lyft, by the way.
They Lyft a couple of days ago as well, that's right.
I was wondering, with regards to Google, is an interesting play here, because Google announced this product called Google Android Automotive, which is different from Android Auto, okay? And Android Automotive is supposed to sit on top of the head end for the infotainment system. So essentially, it will relegate the companies, the tier 1 suppliers that provide infotainment systems like Harman and Bosch, and to just providing hardware. But they're involved. I mean, this is public knowledge. They have public information. They announced a very deep relationship with Volvo. They announced a very deep relationship with Renault. They're supposedly talking to about 30 different OEMs and the various brands, right? That's about licensing technology and licensing know-how. What is not public yet is where, what's going to be happening to the data and who will be getting access to what and how and what's the most.
Yeah, I think the important question to me is in these types of partnerships, what are you actually learning, right? So you see some partnerships, and in many cases the details aren't made public. But many of them, I find myself scratching my head wondering, okay, what is partner A from this particular deal actually learning? Is this just a race to the bottom on acquiring some specific hardware? Or is this something where both parties actually stand to learn something new from the relationship?
I think I'm also mindful of the time, and I realize that you all also want to go home and do better things than listening to us talking. What I thought we'd do is chat, and kind of like chat and conclude with both talk about the internal requirements and what we think that OEMs need to be be thinking about and put that in relation to kind of the mass mobility as a service ingredients, right? Because we already touched upon some of these things, but I think just for the purposes of the audience, it would be good to kind of recap.
Sure, absolutely. So why don't we just list them first, then we can kind of take them one by one maybe. Evangelos and I had said, okay, well, let's presume that the manufacturers are interested in trying to, at least some of them, make this migration towards a sort of mobility company of the future. And let's assume that there's some sort of inclination to put at least some of the capital required into making that transition. We think that there are pretty much four fundamental constraints to making this transition. The first is culture. I think we can talk about that first. Expertise, capital, and regulation were the four specifics that we came up with. Maybe we can start with culture. I think one of the things that I observed for the 8 years while I was in the automotive industry is that there's a bit of a pendulum swing. And back and forth between what expertise you actually wanted to have in-house and what expertise you were actually willing to willingly offload to a supplier. And that's something that tended to go back and forth over time. In some cases, you wanted manufacturers to have direct control over some of the code that they're writing in the modules, the design of the modules themselves. In other cases, they basically just wanted to write a detailed spec and then have somebody send them a box. I think what's been happening over the last couple of decades has been a shift towards increasing levels of expertise in some unconventional domains. I guess I'll speak about it from the context of hiring. So I mentioned earlier that I was involved in recruiting on behalf of the automotive industry as a recruiter for both Ford and for BMW. And now I mentor students. When I graduated from MIT in 2001, people kind of looked at me with a kind of a strange face and said, really, you're going to go to the automotive industry from MIT? That sounds boring. People would say, okay, well, that's, and now, so basically the story has changed altogether. So what used to be a safe but not that exciting place to work is now considered an exciting but not that safe place to work, right? So the story is pretty much backwards. And what I observe now as companies try to recruit is that they're trying to recruit at a higher level than they used to. So it used to be that automotive companies were content to recruit mostly people with a bachelor's degree, just recruit them en masse, right? Maybe dozens or hundreds of engineers, mechanical, electrical, aero-astro engineers at a time, and then train most of what they needed to know on the job. Now, those companies are trying to recruit people with expertise in machine learning, people with expertise in human-machine interfaces, people with expertise in sensing and perception. And these are things where you really actually need to be recruiting typically at the PhD level. It's a very different job to recruit a PhD than it is to recruit somebody coming out of a bachelor's degree. And that's one of the cultural shifts that I'm seeing.
And you really need to think about it in terms of why they need this expertise. And we had I talked about the fact that if you want to be in these mobility services and mobility as a service, you really need to worry about vehicles, right? You need to worry about eventually autonomous systems, right? Because you know that whether you're doing a pod or whether you're doing something that will go longer distance, that's where the world will be heading, even if it takes us a little bit longer to get there. And then you need to talk about all of these services, kind of like a marketplace of services that will be available through these systems. So the areas of expertise that you need is no longer how do I build the next best engine or the next best body. In fact, you may come to the point where the body may have very little relevance on the outside, and all it matters is how do you maximize, very much like the airlines, how do you maximize the number of passengers you can carry, can you maximize the reconfigurability of that cabin, right? Yeah. So that you can have it for more than one purpose. And the big question then becomes, why these companies are sitting in this crossroads and they're saying, okay, how far down the line of the new mobility should I go? Is who is going to deliver that expertise, right? So and to me, it's fascinating the experiment that Lyft, Optiv, and BMW are running in Vegas. Okay, so I don't know if you've heard about this, but Optiv, who has supposedly the lead in that experiment, is using BMW 3 Series cars, where it has put its own AV stack, and these cars can be reserved, the rides can be reserved through the Lyft application in Las Vegas. And they have delivered several tens of thousands of rides. Goes up particularly around CES, but it's going on even now. I mean, you don't have to wait for CES. So this is interesting because here you have BMW that is priding itself for its vehicles and its engineering. I mean, BMW, when it goes to hire people, they are pushing the fact that we are engineering excellence, right? Yet the AV stack, what makes this vehicle autonomous, is really a tier 1 supplier's technology, right? And what is, who knows most about that customer who's calling and is willing to get into that car is Lyft, right? So these guys now are starting to think, okay, in the past we only had to worry about the dealer, right? And what we had to compete with is how to give brand loyalty, right? Can I keep you in that BMW as you're growing more affluent, or as you're getting, as your family is getting bigger? Now they have to worry about, well, will you even care about whether you are in a BMW? Do you even know that you're riding in a BMW, or all you know about is that you're in some 2-door or 4-door car that is moving autonomously? And when you think about what expertise they need to bring into their organizations, is people who will be able to deal with that kind of reality and give them a competitive edge in that reality.
Well, I think that experiment is in fact fascinating, and the stack that's on those vehicles itself was also a merger of 2 separate stacks that Aptiv and Autonomy had developed independently. So you've actually got 2 competing autonomy stacks that were resolved in some way that are then on that BMW, which is on Lyft. It's fascinating.
Right. And they need to keep investing in that. And in the meantime, BMW is investing through Daimler on some autonomy stack. And if you look at that tree, is really Daimler and Bosch. So it's really fascinating, fascinating experiments on that are day after day they're bringing this industry into this dilemma, into this crossroads.
Yeah, and I realized that I said that we'd take culture first, and then we went straight into expertise. So I take the blame for that one. But let's take culture then a little bit as well. You've said experimentation probably 3 or 4 times over the last couple sentences. That's absolutely right. I think that the culture required really is one around experimentation, and I think that this kind of we're seeing the culture manifest itself in a couple of different ways. One, I would say, a culture around safety, and I'll just say it straight out. My experience in the automotive industry is that everybody is laser focused on producing a safe product. And I think that almost everybody that I met in my career in the automotive industry had to internalize that in some fashion, just like somebody in the aviation space. It's just something that's just always in the back of your mind. The way I would treat it is, it's like being a parent of a 2-year-old, right? It's just sort of, what could go wrong, what could go wrong, what could go wrong. It's just something that's kind of baked into your thinking. I don't see the same thing baked into thinking in Silicon Valley. I just don't, sorry. And so, move fast and break things in the transportation space means move fast and kill people. I'm really concerned about where we're headed into a space where software engineers take over more and more of these tasks. However, on the other side of that, I would say, culture in the automotive industry is not one that accepts rapid experimentation, or at least it has not traditionally been. These are decisions that are multi-billion-dollar decisions. I'm sure that the guy who decided to try the Pontiac Aztec is not rolling in dough somewhere on a broad estate, right? These are decisions that have pretty big consequences in the automotive industry. So the willingness to just kind of try to pull the trigger on something new and then let it fail and move on. It's just not something that's been possible in an industry that counts on hundreds of thousands of units and billions of dollars in investment.
Right. And this is really also the commitments to capital, right? In terms of when you make these kind of decisions, because they have to think about the entire system. This is not about, okay, I'll devote $1 million or $2 million into this. Very quickly, and again, we can stay with BMW. It's okay when you say I had a 5-vehicle fleet to test out my autonomous stack. It's a very different story when you say I have now a 600 vehicle fleet that I need to be testing in different cities, under different conditions, under different geometries. And you look at, again, the kind of infrastructure that Waymo had to put in place in order to be able to deal with, today, whatever, 700, 800 vehicles that they have around, and it's still a single model vehicle, right? They haven't even released the Jaguar vehicle that would be part of their fleet. So once you start going from this initial kind of 3, 4, 5 vehicle test of whether it's just a mobility service or of an autonomous vehicle, and you start expanding that, you don't even need to go to production. Just that experimentation is getting really expensive real quickly. And it's no longer just an R&D project that doesn't even appear in a line item. And very quickly it starts flashing red lights and then goes up to the CFO, and again, depending on the environment, you end up having very serious conversations. So this in terms of being able to have these conversations and make these decisions is one of the critical requirements as these companies are moving to.
I think it's a really dangerous thing to be managing a small, innovative business in a large, profitable company. Because I think the temptation at very high levels of management can be to invest just enough to do it badly, right? Because in many cases, doing it well requires hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Doing it badly might only require a couple of million, right? And so I think, and if you are that person that's managing that innovative business, you may be tempted to lowball the cost number to your management just so you can get the thing off the ground at all, right? So I don't think there are a lot of alignment of incentives there. There's a lot of temptation to do it and do it badly, fail, and then not be able to learn much from what you did.
And how is their experience with regulation so far? We talked about cafe earlier. How is that going to help them or not?
Well, I think in the interest of time, I'll probably just keep it pretty simple for the regulation. I think the automotive business is a very well-defined business. It's a mature business. People know who regulates what. So, for those of you who are not spending a lot of time in transportation regulation, I think number one is there are a lot of different levels at which you can regulate. You can regulate at the city level. You can regulate at the state level, at the national level, and there are even some things that are done at an international level, kind of in a looser sense. And then you've got different verticals where regulation happens. There's regulation around safety. There's regulation around efficiency and energy usage and environmental concerns. There's regulation around access, right? Equality of service, ADA, Civil Rights Act type of legislation, right? And so you've got this whole matrix of relatively well-defined agencies that regulate relatively well-defined portions of the automotive ecosystem. But when you're talking about a new business, like mobility as a service, and I think there are dozens of examples in current events, people don't really understand who regulates what, right? We see it around worker classification, right? We see it, the Public Utilities Commission getting involved in regulating vehicle economy and fleet makeup, right? We see it around transparency of pricing, right? There are all different kinds of regulations, and since the business itself hasn't arrived at a stable model, regulation absolutely can't evolve to a stable model. And so a friend of mine and I have actually been working on another opinion piece around what we call regulation by proxy, right? That's really what's happening. You see an agency says, well, my mandate is to regulate this thing here, right, my public mandate, but what I'm really concerned about is what's happening over here. And those two things are related by some thread, and so I'll regulate the thing that I legally have purview over in order to impact the thing that my city residents are really concerned about. That's not fully evolved yet. We'll see, I think, new regulatory agencies to deal with this ecosystem, and certainly new regulations.
And I say to several of our corporate partners that I think the automotive industry will need to start paying more attention to what is happening and what has happened to the airline industry. Because we have a misconception as consumers that the airline industry has been deregulated back in the Act of '78, but the only thing that has been deregulated is the pricing aspect of it, right? The airline industry is very heavily regulated, and that's what makes us as consumers comfortable getting on a plane or not comfortable, given, again, what's happening with the MAX, for example, right now. And I think there are many lessons there in terms of the path that the industry has taken and the role that the United States has taken with regards to regulation and how we have educated the rest of the world on how well-functioning regulatory bodies exist in that industry and how they can be examples for the new mobility industry.
So I think, I think we've touched at least on these four areas, touched on culture, expertise, capital, regulation. So where does that leave us in terms of state of play? What do you see domestically, internationally?
So I think that so for me, over the next couple of years, it will be a period where it will separate the men from the boys, as I said, right? It will separate the companies that are serious about mobility services, even though they may not know what the ultimate future is going to be, but they're willing to push it because they have a plan and they have a vision of where it can go. Because they're also concerned about where their existing industry is going to end up. I think we are going to see consolidation on the startup side, significant, and I think that will be good, in my opinion. Because if nothing else, we will start reconcentrating talent in a few companies and a few private companies and making them even stronger and make them actually good candidates for partnerships and acquisitions by the incumbents. I don't believe that, I will end by saying, I don't believe that the incumbents will ever be in a position again to say, oh my God, this was just a dead dream. I'm going back to selling vehicles like I was doing for the previous 70, 100 years. I think that time is gone. And so there's definitely a big transformation that is happening and will continue to happen. I don't think that everybody will be a beneficiary of this transformation, though. I think there will be several victims, as it typically happens. Think of Eastern Airlines. Who remembers Eastern Airlines anymore, right? But you or Pan Am, TWA, yet they blaze some trail.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent this is healthy, right? The boom and the bust to a certain extent is healthy. You see headlines, or you've seen them over the past couple of years, companies saying they want to hire 1,000 self-driving car engineers. Well, I don't know if there are 1,000 good self-driving car engineers. And so I think what there's been is a tendency to overinvest, in some cases at the expense of quality control. Any startup with a dream and a PowerPoint can get a little bit of funding, right? At least could have. And so I think a pullback causing investors to, let's say, do a little bit more due diligence or look a little bit more into the details and the alternatives, I think is not necessarily an unhealthy thing. I think we do need to continue to see the experimentation of the business models. And one of the things that I see is in the mobility space that seems to be happening at a more rapid pace in the countries outside the US. So you see it with Didi and Dida in China, experimenting quite a bit with business models, with Grab experimenting with integrating fleet management as part of the stack, integration of public transit, unconventional modes of transportation. You see it in India with Ola, some of the recently announced partnerships. And so I think that the companies here in the US really need to start iterating quite a bit faster in this space.
Thank you very much for indulging us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Evangelos. If you have a few questions, you can kind of catch these guys up.
And there are trash cans in the back against the back wall. If everyone could please take their trash out, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
How about the price? The drawing
And
price.
one last thing, yep, the drawing.
Yeah. Need to do a drawing. I'm confident. Okay, let's go. Let it go.
I'm quite sure what
Okay, we're gonna do the raffle. Hold on 1 second. The number is, check your raffle tickets, everyone. Pull out your raffle tickets. Okay. Winner is 0, 3, 9, 6, 1, 4. Anyone?
Not here.
0, 3, 9, 6, 1, 4.
I'm off by 2. I'm off by 2.
Wait, Rachid, congratulations, Rachid.
What is he getting?
He's getting an Oculus Go, thanks to TIBCO. Thank you, TIBCO, again for hosting.
We'll talk later, guys.
Yeah.
There's a the way the transportation
Once every 2
That means I will discharge my battery.